Welcome to What is Going for new thought from the edge of Each week on OMTimes flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. This week, we welcome back to the show internationally acclaimed astrologer, ceremonial teacher, and Mayan calendar researcher, Barbara Hand Clow, the author of numerous best-selling books, including The Pleiadian Agenda, Alchemy of the Nine Dimensions, and Awakening the Planetary Mind. Barbara Hand Clow joins me in the first of 3 monthly interviews, one for each volume of her first body of fictional, or should I say factional, work, the Revelations Trilogy, which has been described as an intricately layered erotic thriller that reveals esoteric teachings on prophecy, power, ritual, and divination, suppressed discoveries of the first Christian heretics, and secret power rituals at work in the Vatican. Barbara Hand Clow, welcome back.
Hi, Sandie.
It's good to have you back on the show, Barbara.
Well, thank you. I'm very anxious to talk to you again.
So you always wanted to write fiction, but writing your Revelations trilogy doesn't feel as though it was just about achieving a lifelong ambition. I think there was a deeper purpose behind these books and the timing of their publication.
Yeah, I would say that the timing ended up just being perfect. It just came through right for me at the right time, and also I think for the culture.
So you hadn't actually been holding on to this story for a long time and then released it at the right time?
Well, great question. One of the main characters, Sarah Adamson, is basically my PhD. She went ahead and got a PhD in patristics over a period of, number of years. And meanwhile, after I got out of graduate school, I started researching for this book 35 years ago now.
So this is a fictional tale that has a lot of fact in it. And the story begins in 2011, a year that was characterized by revolutions, riots, death, and disasters, the rise of ISIS, Arab Spring, all of those things, and massive upheaval. And it ends a decade later with the global breakdown triggered by COVID-19 in 2021. As an astrologer, you had a pretty good overview of what that decade might bring. Was that knowledge a big motivation for the timeline it covers and the timing of its publication?
Yeah. Well, I knew that I wanted to start the trilogy at the end of the Mayan calendar, which is 2011, 2012, in that range, because so many people have felt so strongly that there could be a major change at that point. So it needed to start there, but the question, how far out was going to go? And I knew, of course, if I was going to write a trilogy, it would probably take about 10 years. So I could pretty well guess it would go out to 2021. But then when I did the astrology, I could see that our world was going to crack in 2020, in March specifically, because of some astrological transits. And so that's when I really realized I had to write this. I had to show what was going on once time in some form ended or shifted into some other form. And then what would happen when that whole kind of new egg of reality would crack. And so that's how I got my timeline.
What was your intention for this book? Was it to share hidden knowledge that you wanted to expose, alchemical tools that you wanted to teach?
Well, I had some specific intentions, like exposing more truth about priestly sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. But my real intention with this trilogy was to deal with what the end of the age of Pisces meant. And the age of Pisces is basically from 100 BC through 2000 AD. And the age of Pisces is the age of organized religions and also the age of militant religions. And so I wanted to explore how it would work as these religions started breaking down, because now we're moving into Aquarius now, we're in Aquarius now. And I really wanted to cover what happened before, because I don't think people have a lot of understanding about these 2,000 years.
Yeah. So the story is a fictional journey undertaken by 6 friends who aren't necessarily friends to begin with. And it has some supporting characters that include a master alchemist, a Jesuit priest, a Vatican archivist, and a covert agent for the church's secret agenda. All of your characters are very clearly defined, with backgrounds, lineages, faiths, and careers that naturally provide them with all the knowledge that you want to share. Did you have to do a lot of research to create those characters?
I didn't, Sandie. Those characters all came through to me in 3 hours.
Wow.
I went to my meditation space in 2010 and said, okay, it's time to write fiction. And how do I do that? And my guides are the Pleiadians, or maybe it's just my higher self. I'm not sure whether any of us really know what these guides are. But basically they said, get out a yellow legal pad, a long one, and a pen. And I did. And then they gave me all the names, ages, background, personal interests, and stories of all of these characters, except for one. One came in later. So there I was in 2010. I had all my characters. And then I got to sit down with them to see who they were.
Wow. Yeah. What a great way to write a book.
Well, Anthony Trollope, one of my favorite writers, did the same thing. So I was following kind of an illustrious lineage there. But the interesting thing about it is, why were 70-80% of the characters Italian? And lucky for me, I have spent, and hope to go back again, quite a bit of time in Italy. And I feel like I know parts of Italy fairly well. And so I had a setting. And then, as it turned out, that setting was very significant, because the whole Italian peninsula has a lot to do with the way things work on our planet, which I explore in the trilogy.
Wow, so that's interesting. So it also gave you, obviously, it's the home of the Vatican, the powerful Medici family, and lots of things, a really rich and colourful history there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Italian culture is fascinating. I mean, you almost can't lose if you decide to set a novel in Italy with a bunch of Italians. It's just a beautiful country, and it's a beautiful creative culture. And so, since I love it so much, of course, I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, great place to go for your research. So Sarah, who is, one of the dominant characters in the book. I mean, she's a beautiful young Catholic graduate student from Boston, studying at the Vatican Library for her thesis on the first Christian heretic, Marcion of Pontus. What is the significance of that particular character, Marcion?
Well, Marcion ended up being so much more significant than I could have imagined. And of course, the great thing about writing fiction, it was unraveling for me. I mean, I couldn't wait to get the next chapter down to see what was going to happen. And Marcion has turned out to be a really pivotal figure at this time in history, although very few people know about it. I obviously wrote the trilogy partly so that people can kind of wake up. But Marcion's issue, and Marcion is back in 100 BC to like the early first century. And Marcion's issue, he at that time, of course, in his case, he was Jewish, and yet he had fallen in love with Jesus, and he became an evangelist for Jesus. And so his issue was, having been Jewish and now having converted to Christianity, his issue was that he felt very, very strongly that the new Christian church should be a new church and a beginning of a new religion. And he felt very strongly that it should not attach itself strongly to Judaism, particularly scripturally. And so if you open up the Bible, the Christian Bible, you'll find that the first 1,000 pages are the Hebrew Bible. And the last 100 pages approximately are the 4 Gospels and the letters and all that kind of stuff. And I remember doing that when I was given a Bible when I was 12. And unlike most kids, I read it. And I went, what is this? Why is this all the Hebrew Bible, and why is so little of this Bible Christianity? And Marcion really wanted to start fresh. And now that we've come to the age of Pisces, I think that would have been a lot better. Because it doesn't cast an aspersion on Judaism, because Judaism has their own religion and their own scriptures. In fact, I think I'm quite sure that a lot of Jewish people didn't appreciate having all of their scriptural material cribbed by the Christians. You know, so the idea here, Sandie, would be that if we're going to, now, first of all, 2,100 years ago, the age of Aries was ending and the age of Pisces was beginning, the age of organized religion. And it just isn't natural to carry on all of the material from the previous age into the holy scriptural works of a new religion. So that's what Marcion is all about. And Marcion, I, of course, did my theological training. Marcion was considered the greatest heretic of all time by the Catholic Church.
By the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so one of the reasons you don't know people don't know much about him is all of his works were destroyed and his name was removed from historical records. But I think he's a very important figure.
So there must have been more reasons why they wanted him wiped out of the picture.
Well, the other issue, I'll put it right in here, is the issue of the Gnostics. And Marcion was not a Gnostic. As I told you, he was Jewish and then became Christian. But the Gnostics were an ancient religion. Some people think that the Gnostics were only a few hundred years of history. But the Gnostics actually go back around 10, 12,000 years, back into the really early primordial, early religious developments on our planet. And when the Christian church started to formulate itself, the big competitor was the Gnostics. And so, like any emerging religion or any emerging factor in culture, they decided to just squash the Gnostics. And so, besides destroying all of Marcion's works, they also destroyed all of the original works of the Gnostics. And we didn't know anything about the Gnostics except what the Christians said about them until some Gnostic texts were discovered in 1948, the Nag Hammadi scrolls. And for the first time, we started, actually, it was 1974. I gave you the wrong date there. But for the first time, when the Nag Hammadi scrolls were discovered in Egypt, we had the texts of the Gnostics and what they had to say. And what they had to say is indeed very prophetic and very interesting, because it has created, by silencing them, basically, we've created a major aberration, because the Gnostics had a lot to say about how evil works in the world and how negative forces work in the world. And that was just taken away from culture. And I think it's something that we really need.
I do want to, a little bit later on in the show, talk about that point. But first, tell us a little bit about the characters and the plot. What is going on here?
Excuse me, I missed that.
Tell us a little bit about the characters and the plot.
Okay. The characters and the plot, lucky for me, were a group of very intelligent people coming from many, many different perspectives. Sarah, of course, is a Catholic scholar, and she ends up marrying a Jewish writer for the New York Times who's stationed in Rome. And so we have a Jewish character, and then a person who's stationed in Rome. And then the very next thing that happens immediately in Ruby Crystal that I really like is Ruby Crystal is multi-generational, because Sarah has extremely interesting parents. And then Simon, the person that she marries, also has extremely interesting parents. And then the various Italians living in Italy and in Rome and Tuscany, they have very interesting parents. So we're dealing with the kind of boomer generation parents, in a sense, dealing with cultural change. And then the next generation coming along. And that was a lot of fun, because what it does is it gives you so many viewpoints on looking at an issue or looking at a subject.
So, what is so special about the ruby stone that it appears in the title?
Well, Simon, when he asks Sarah to marry him, he gives her a family heirloom. And the family heirloom is a very, very special ruby crystal that's basically been historically existent for like 10,000 years, because originally it came from the Buddha somewhere in the eastern part of the world. And the stone what's important about the stone is it makes Sarah psychic. And by the way, I wear it all the time. And this isn't a valuable ruby. If this were a cut ruby, it'd be worth a fortune. But it's called a star ruby. And when you look into the star ruby, you can actually see the figure of the Buddha inside the ruby.
Wow.
And so what it did was the minute Sarah put it on her finger because she was engaged, she started becoming psychic. And so there we have a Catholic scholar who's becoming a psychic, and young. And so it was really fun to develop her.
Yeah, yeah. She also remembers her past life as a Roman oracle whose powers are now being channeled by the Vatican to maintain world control. How are they channeling those powers?
Well, most likely she was one of her past lives was the Sibyl of Cumae, and most likely the Sibyl of Cumae was a Gnostic, because Sarah is just inherently a deep Gnostic scholar. She keeps trying to be a good Catholic girl, but she doesn't buy it. She's a Gnostic.
Yeah. She's she says at one point, that she cannot find Christ in the church. She leaves the church, but she could never leave Christ.
Yeah. And that was another one of the themes that developed as I went along, that fascinated me, because I do feel, and I once was Catholic, and I do feel that Christ is not in the church. So that was coming from a very deep feeling basis. And I think part of the reason it happened is because of priestly celibacy and then the ensuing abuse that happened. So the whole trilogy is deeply based on dealing with celibacy issues, sacramental issues in the church. I once was a student of Matthew Fox, and I know you know Matthew Fox and admire him. And Matthew Fox was kind of my first step out of being a Catholic, and we eventually did leave the church. But the second step, the deeper step for really leaving the church, is dealing with sacramental issues, like what's really going on with communion, what's really going on with confession. And I went really deeply into those issues, because I think it's very important for Catholics to consider these issues, because they may really believe in these sacraments, which is fine. And I'm not advocating, by the way, the end of any religion. I'm just looking for more clarity.
And there is a character who in the first book, provides quite a bit of conflict, Armando, who comes from an incredible lineage and is very wealthy, famous painter. And he's a very, very troubled soul that has certain episodes bordering on the evil. Mm-hmm. And he's very closely aligned to the church.
Yeah, you're talking about Armando Pierleoni.
Yeah.
And Armando Pierleoni is the oldest son of a very wealthy very interesting ancient Italian family that actually goes back a couple of thousand years. And in his case, he is struggling with evil forces as an artist, as well as in his personal life. And he starts out in the book being very, very, not the kind of person you'd want to have lunch with, shall we say. But what happens through the trilogy is he transcends to a higher and higher level, going all the way through. And I loved working with this character because I wanted to show what can happen with redemption and with somebody conquering their negative issues. And in this case, he did a lot of work with a Jungian analyst named Lorenzo Giannini. And Lorenzo Giannini is a really, really amazing analyst. And I also just love showing what therapy can do for a troubled person.
And we discover later on that, the root of Armando's problems was that he was raped as a child by a priest. Yeah. And so there's an awful lot in the book. There's a lot of real events like the Vati leaks, the whole resignation of Pope Benedict. There's all kinds of stories in there that are true, taken straight from the news, about some of the abuse that has taken place in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, all of the background material in the book, the stories, are all absolutely accurate historically. The characters, of course, who are dealing with these issues are fictional, and that's an interesting combination. And I think Dan Brown really created a breakthrough for those of us. So this is called content fiction, where the content is absolutely correct in all ways, and yet the novel itself is totally fictional.
Yeah. Well, you talked earlier about evil, and Sarah's research and her visions reveal the cause of evil in the church. And then Simon, her husband's reporting, exposes the depth of the sexual abuse scandals. Why, we can say we understand why there is so much sexual abuse, because priests should never be made to be celibate. No human being should be forced to be celibate in the first place. But I think that there are other reasons for that, aren't there?
Yeah, I don't feel that I thoroughly understand how evil has come into the world at all. But I do feel like I've got, a decent handle on it. And one of the books that I wrote many years ago was originally titled Catastrophobia, is now titled Awakening the Planetary Mind, because things changed so much after 10 years after writing it that I had to revise it extensively to add new material. I didn't change the book, I just added new material. The basic thesis of Catastrophobia is that our planet went through a solar system level cataclysm around 12,000 years ago. It looks like the exact date is 11,600 years ago. And because of that solar system level cataclysm, which even included stripping Mars of its atmosphere, the Earth went through a tremendous cataclysmic experience. And most of the people on the planet were severely traumatized. And in Catastrophobia, I explored the possibility that we are a multi-traumatized species. And I believe we are. And I believe we're in the middle of waking up. And as you know from therapy for people who have suffered childhood abuse, you can't get at the problem without remembering what actually happened. You don't have to remember everything in detail, but you need to at least imprint something happened to you. And our whole planet has been living in a sort of hypnotic state of not realizing what happened to us 12,000 years ago. And so we continually carry this trauma along. And Sandie, I think that's the source of evil. I think it's the buried fear and the lack of knowledge about what has happened to us that makes us prone to falling into evil tendencies. So that's my own take on it.
Is that as a kind of unconscious defensive measure?
A kind of what?
Is that an unconscious defensive response?
Yes,
that you have that tendency?
Yeah, and I think it's the cause of a lot of disease and unease, and I think it's the cause of a lot of confusion. And I think as we go through this so-called global warming crisis, which is actually much, much more going on here than that, we're at the point in our solar system where we're having a similar level of cataclysmic change. And I think that the change going on around us in the weather and the weather systems on the planet, I think is forcing people to wake up. And it's very, very agonizing time for people.
Yes. Just to go back to the abuse in the Catholic Church, I was really surprised. There was a little line in there that caught my attention where you said that the origination of that whole idea of priests being celibate was a financial decision.
Yes, yes. Yeah. So what happened in the church is, let's scroll back 1,000 years and go back to around 1000 AD. And the church, of course, was gradually developing. It went through the feudal state, and the church was really starting to come into its power 1,000 years ago. And if you're going to have power, you got to have money. And the church was losing a tremendous amount of income because the priests would have families, and then their families would inherit property and all that. And the church needed to get a hold of a lot of property and a lot of money, which it has, as we all know. The Vatican is one of the most highly capitalized organizations on the planet. And so celibacy was declared a rule of the church to be a priest in the Catholic Church. And then, of course, we start to get more pressure on the idea that the priests are going to be celibates because Jesus was a celibate. And the only problem is that's a fairy story. We have enough evidence now that we now know that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. Jesus had a family, probably had children. And so the whole basis of celibacy of the church is based on a fairy story.
And a really awful desire to be rich. You know, I mean, when you think the consequences of that through the ages, the number of children that have been abused, the number of priests who are probably doing something that they never would have done if they'd been able to, you know, not be celibate, and all in the name of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. And then also a lot of people have asked me, still ask me, like, why children? Well, I think that in order to decide to be a priest and to be celibate and to follow that role, a fair percentage of the people who do that are going to have a strong tendency to have a lot of deep, unresolved juvenile issues. And I think what happens is there's a strong tendency, there was. Let's hope this is changing because the church has been doing a fairly good job of cleaning some of it up. But what goes on is the poor priest is just unconscious because he never really had the chance to develop in a normal way that then creates a lot of abnormality.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Benedict comes across, you know, not just in your book, but in real life as not being a very nice man at all. I know that, you know, from Matthew Fox, the things he did to Matthew Fox, he kind of, you know, excluded him from the church simply because Matthew had ideas that they didn't like. I mean, the fact that he called he called Godmother, he called the Catholic Church a dysfunctional family, and he refused to condemn homosexuality. And for that, he's out.
Yeah. And Ratzinger, Benedict, was once called, his name was Ratzinger. Ratzinger was the head of the, forget the name of the group now, but it's the same thing as the Inquisition. He was the one who was going after everybody before he became Pope. So then once he got in as Pope, then he just went further and further. And yeah, I was close to Matthew during that period. I was the editor at Bear & Company, and Matthew and I worked together closely. And it was very, very painful for Matthew because Matthew is a very, very dedicated, deep feeling person. Very painful for him.
Yeah, I'm sure. In the book, Simon vacillates between thinking Pope Benedict was a pawn and wondering if he's been the director of the priestly abuse program for many years.
Yeah.
What's your thought on that?
Well, I think it's about the worst thing you could do because what it did is to put a firm cap on it just when it was exploding and boiling. And it took the laity, the people in the church, a while to figure out what was going on. But of course, eventually you can't keep this kind of thing, secret. And so I think by trying to repress it that way, and of course the other issue is Vatican II. We did have a church congress that opened up the church a lot during the 60s, and a lot of people had a lot of hope. Like for example, just a simple thing. Just imagine how the whole situation with the Catholic Church, and now in our current moment with the abortion issues, just think how different all of that could have been if the Catholic Church just approved birth control.
Mm.
If you approve birth control and support it well, you pretty much can do away with the problem of abortion. You know, and this is a good example of people that the biggest problem with celibacy is that many priests do not understand families. They do not understand mothers having children and fathers supporting families. They just don't understand. And how can they be in a position to guide people when they absolutely don't understand what these people's lives are like? You know?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. You mention in the book Carl Kalleman and the winds of history cycles of historical tension between East and West. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, that goes back to the issue of the novel being located in Italy. So when all the characters came in, all the Italian characters, and when I realized I could locate the novel in Rome, Tuscany, Florence, that part of Italy, um, I also had done a lot of research with Carl Kalleman, and I wrote a book on the Mayan calendar. And one of the most interesting things about Carl Kalleman's research is the midline. And the midline is a line that's basically 12 degrees east longitude on our planet. It goes from like Gabon in Africa, comes up through Tunisia, up through Rome, up through Germany, and up through Scandinavia. And what happens is that Kalman came up with a great term called the winds of history, which is that there's a cyclical back and forth going on with that midline from the west to the east and from the east to the west. And it shows up historically very profoundly. And so Kalaman's historical analysis is excellent, and I certainly wasn't going to have much more to say about it because he did the job. But the question is, what's going on psychologically and energetically with people? And then once I started exploring that issue of the power of the midline, going through all the way through Italy, that's when I started to realize that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the head of the Catholic Church, the Vatican, is located right on the midline, and they are manipulating people psychologically by taking advantage of that midline. And what happens is he strongly tied into that conflict between East and West and Muslim and Christianity and back and forth. What it does is it just simply takes down your ability to have a sane view of reality. And then, of course, I was privy to a lot of secret information. And the great thing about fiction is fiction gives you the chance to tell a story through a character, and the story is supposedly fictional, but it's like something about something that's true. And so I happen to know that there is an issue with the Vatican running masses underneath the Vatican area in Rome, 24/7, 7 days a week. And these masses are mind controlling the members of the church. And, you know, communion is a beautiful sacrament, and there are many beautiful things about the idea of communion. But people have got to get to be more conscious of mind control and, you know, being basically hypnotized would be a good way to do it. It hypnotizes people.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that one, the thought projections, whether that was true or not.
Pardon?
I was going to ask you about that
Yeah.
particular piece about the thought projections,
Yeah.
the manipulation, whether that was true or not.
Yeah. And then what I had more fun with on that score is confession, because confession has been used as a technique for 2,000 years to basically 1,500 years to know what people are doing and what people are thinking about. And so confession, I really went after confession hard from the point of view of the church using it as a control device, which it's basically the same thing, that's going on at this point with AI and the internet. And then the other issue with confession that I developed much more deeply, that I think is much more meaningful, is that if you take all of the things you've done to the confessor, you won't go to the person that you hurt and deal with the person directly. And Armando, who does all these awful things in the first book in the trilogy, ends up speaking with all of the people that he hurt once he realized what he had done. And there's no other kind of forgiveness that exists except working it out with the person you did it to. And I have a feeling we're going to see some interesting things in our society as people grow up a little bit more and figure that out. Crime doesn't function very well if people are actually talking to each other and sharing with each other what they're doing.
Yeah. Sex features quite prominently in the trilogy as alchemy, as abuse, and of course as a form of control. What is it about sex, that enslaves people?
Yes, I know. And this again is how evil functions. And as you know, I'm sure, like most of our listeners and viewers know, there are really big issues right now with enslavement of people and enslavement of children. And the only good thing I can say about it is a lot of stuff is being exposed now. And people get the idea that it's the first time it happened. This has been going on for a long, long time. And the question is, how are we going to get conscious and change it? The only way is to expose the secrets.
Yeah. Well, you weren't afraid to cover a lot of the true events, to tackle some explosive issues like the systemic homosexuality, the corruption, blackmail, even murder. And you're also quite critical of past popes and high-ranking officials. Did you have to think about that at all? Should I be this honest or not? Or was it just you were going for it?
Felt that and I still feel that the essence of fiction is to really let these characters be who they are. So sure, there's some things that the characters would have done that I didn't describe. And I don't like to write about unpleasant things, Sandie. It's not my nature. But there is a time when we've got to be truthful about what people are actually doing. We have to, And so I've exposed a lot from that point of view. But this isn't the kind of fiction that's all blood and gore and ugly and horrible. You know what I mean? I don't like any sex or violence in fiction that isn't there for a very, very good reason. But sometimes you have to just say, this is what actually happened.
Yeah. So when Benedict resigned, and you cover that in the book, and people were wondering who was going to come along next, and was it going to be a complete new order, or was it going to be more of the same but disguised? What is your view about the current Pope?
This is a hard question. I've been on the fence about this Pope 100% from the beginning, and I still am at this point. I think he's very enigmatic. I think it's possible that he's doing a lot more good things than any of us realize. Here he is, the Pope, at one of the most difficult periods in history. So I had fun exploring Francis, and again, that is the beauty of fiction. I could explore his mystical moments, his moments in time when he struggled as a human being, and I think he's probably going to ultimately be thought of as a very, very great poet. But I don't know. I think he's very enigmatic person.
Did you see the resignation of the previous Pope in astrology?
I wasn't looking, so no. I think at one point I analyzed it and could see why it broke at that moment, but I don't think the break in that was astrological. The timing. The reason I don't think so is because there was a warrant out for Benedict because of sexual issues and perceived, not him personally, but because of what was going on in the church. And basically, he couldn't leave the Vatican because, see, the Vatican is a completely sovereign entity in its own right. And if you're inside there, they can't just go in there and get you. Well, you tell me, why is he still living there? This is the only time in 2,000 years we've had two popes residing at the Vatican. I don't think he can go out the door.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is that they're after, but I think there's a good sign that that's it.
With regard to astrology, do we have, I mean, is there any way that one can retrospectively go back in time and look at the astrology of some of these events that are documented in, far, far history, and see the correlation, between what happened and the astrology?
Yeah, who did that is Richard Tarnas in a book called Cosmos and Psyche, where he went back over the great historical cycles. And I actually have some cycle. I may write a book on some of these cycles myself. I'm thinking about it. But the real issue behind that is, to what degree are we controlled by the cycles and the fate? And to me, I've been having a dark night of the soul for the last 2 years, because once I finished my trilogy, and once I saw that reality did crack in March of 2020, it scares me, to tell you the truth. But I think the issue is whether we're going to become conscious. I don't know whether you use astrology at all, but for me, using a transit intelligently, there's a huge difference between being unconscious of what's happening to you. So I think the whole push in astrology ultimately is going to be to get people conscious about these cycles. And that's why somebody like Richard Tarnas has devoted so much time to it. Quite a few of us have.
Yeah. I had a question written down that was really about, fate versus free will. And that was whether COVID was fated or whether we could have avoided it.
Yeah. Well, here's the difficult time. This is a simple one I can explain really easily. 2020, 2021, 2019, that period, it's the key point of a 735-year cycle. So one of the things the trilogy gets into is the 735-year cycle, and it goes back. The previous high point was 1285 AD, and now we've come to another beginning of another cycle. And what happens with this particular cycle, and what it comes from, is it's the conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto in Capricorn every 735 years. So specifically, it's Capricorn. That's the rub here with this particular cycle. So what happens with 735-year cycle is the old ways just get thrown in the toilet and a whole new regime comes in. And what we're faced with right now is artificial intelligence. So the beginning of this 735-year cycle, I would suggest the issue is artificial intelligence. And the previous cycle was the development of banking and coordinated societies through banking and money. So now this one is probably artificial intelligence. Question is, are we going to handle it better if we know that? Possibly we would.
So, I mean, we can see, the decline, the evidence, the disintegration all around us in every arena of life as we've known it. How long do you think, from astrology, can you tell how long this period last?
Well, the breakdown is the hard part. There's an incredible history book called 1177 BC that shows when the whole Mediterranean fell apart. And when this happens, things just fall apart. People don't go to work. People don't cope anymore. And we're, as you know, we're really, really in the middle of this. So, of course, I don't have to tell you that I'm taking a deep look at it. And I see some signs of improvement coming in the next 4 years. I see signs of improvement up through 2027 AD, 2023 to 2027. I actually think that we may have hit the worst of it, possibly. Although just being in the middle of it, it's collapsing is awful.
Mm.
You know, and I'm working on that. I'm not going to say anything in print unless I really think I understand it. But I do see some signs for optimism.
Mm. In the book, Sarah says that she suspects that Jesus came to Earth from another planet to seed a new religion of love and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is true?
I think that's probably true, but of course, my research never stops. And are you familiar with the work of I guess he's an Episcopalian theologian, Paul Wallace? You're familiar with his work, yeah. Well, Paul Wallace has done a really good job on a concept that he describes as paleo contact.
Yes.
And he thinks that the earliest records in the scriptures, and therefore this would be the Jewish background as well as Sumerian and Babylonian. He thinks that what was actually being described in the early scriptures was contact with extraterrestrials. And I've experienced that, and I think that's true. And so therefore, if ever there was a person, to look at, it would be Jesus.
Yeah. Paul has been a frequent guest on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly what he is saying vindicates everything that Eric von Daniken had been saying and has been pilloried for over the years.
Mm-hmm. Well, good, because so you know Paul's work.
Yes.
Then there's another person, Flavio Barbiero, and he wrote a book in 2011 called the Moses Secret Society, something that's pretty close. And he shows that once this paleo contact occurred, and once culture was shaken up that way about 3,000 years ago, then what happened is a whole kind of conspiracy and secret society developed around the power of Moses. And so the issue isn't just the contact, it's also the control by the invading entities that come to our planet. And so when I was reading Paul Wallace, because I just ran into him very recently, that's when I started remembering Flavio Barbiero's book on the Moses Secret Society.
Mm.
In other words, we're dealing with a conspiracy now that's breaking up, that's 3,000 years old. It isn't just the beginning of Christianity.
Yeah. You offer some tools in the book. Can you share a few of them with us?
And I share what?
Tools, ancient tools, esoteric secrets. Is there anything that you can share with our audience, something that they could put into practice in their daily life to improve things?
I think this is the time for people to work with manifestation. And I'm not talking about gold Cadillacs. I'm just talking about day by day as we go through this breakdown. If you can hold and there are many different techniques for doing this, but if you can hold your mind clearly on what you're actually intending to do and what you're actually doing, it can make a huge difference in an environment like this. Because otherwise, after a while, everybody's falling apart around you and you fall apart too,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think clear mental direction is really critically important this time. And of course, always coming from the heart. There's always the issue of coming from the heart, which is always the first and foremost thing for me and hopefully for many people. But that mental focus really counts a lot now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Writing this trilogy and the way the characters came to you, do you miss them?
No, because they're still around. I would like to write a fourth book of this trilogy, and if it does well enough, I think I probably will. It's not going to be worth it if a lot of people don't get into it, because then the
Yeah.
characters we're all involved with each other, not just me, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're still around me. I especially like Alessandro de Medici.
Yeah.
He's a real
Yeah.
wise figure who comes in at the end of Source. I would love to develop him more.
Mm. And how is the book doing?
I think it's doing okay. I haven't checked lately, actually, but I think most people would consider it to be a success. I'd like it to reach a lot more people. I certainly do not think it's reaching a huge number of people.
Do you get a lot of comments from people? Are people writing to you either upset or, really thrilled with what you've written?
Um, I do cure comments and get comments, but of course, authors have to be very private, especially if you're writing the type of literature that I've been writing. But I'm not feeling like people are. I'm mostly getting thank you for having the courage to do it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, because the American public can be very reactionary.
Mm.
I remember when Philip Pullman wrote his Dark Materials, and everybody felt that he was just, it was blasphemy.
Yeah,
Have
yeah.
you had?
I haven't gotten any blasphemy. I thought I would years ago, and I haven't gotten that. You know.
Mm, yeah. So the book, you say that it is claimed that the book offers readers a 9-dimensional initiation
Mhm.
encoded in it. Are you receiving any feedback about what people are
Yeah,
experiencing?
that's a good question to ask, Sandie. The most consistent feedback I get is that people have been following me for years in nonfiction, and they really like that my nine-dimensional work is very, very widely accepted and honored. And people are telling me that they love the trilogy because now they can experience the nine dimensions by reading the books. Because the
Yeah.
characters, of course, have nine-dimensional experiences. And so that's the most important feedback, I think, because the purpose of writing it what was to help people experience nine dimensions of consciousness.
Have has anybody recorded the book? Is it
Not,
available on
not
Audible?
yet. Not yet.
I think it would be interesting to experience hearing it, because I think that too creates, experiences.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'd love to see that happen. It takes a good reader. That's always the difficulty, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that'll probably happen. Scientifically speaking, Alchemy of Nine Dimensions just received another major proof about a week ago. Did you read the material about how all of the black holes in the
Yeah.
universe are binary, and
Yes.
they're in a relationship, a binary relationship? This is another proof of superstring theory. And lurking behind Alchemy of Nine Dimensions is Edward Witten's superstring theory. And I know that I'm right about this. That nine dimensions. That these are a way of describing the nine dimensions, because when Edward Witten wrote his calculations for 11-dimensional consciousness, or 11-dimensional string theory, that was when the Pleiadian agenda came in through me. In other words, it came in at exactly the same time. Edward Witten's theory, and then the alchemy theory. And then at the time, I was an acquisitions editor at Bear and Company, and I received 4 queries for exactly the same material that had come into 4 people at exactly the same time. So we got a download at that point. This is 1995. And when that download is finally expressed scientifically and mathematically, that's when multidimensional consciousness is going to be more available to the individual. So I'm just waiting. I know it is right.
Yes, well, that's something to look forward to. Barbara, we have to end it here. We're out of time. But you are coming back in a month to give us a dive into book 2, which has lots of secrets of its own. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I can't wait because Aquarian Age will be a little bit it's a lighter book.
Yeah. So Revelations of the Ruby Crystal, which we've been discussing today, is the first book in Barbara Hand Clow's Revelations Trilogy. Next month, she will be back to discuss book 2, Revelations of the Aquarian Age, which contains hidden secrets of the use of crystals and some extraordinary information about secret societies. And the Revelations Trilogy is published by Inner Traditions Bear and Company and is available at all good bookstores. For more information about Barbara Hand Clow, visit her website at handclow2012.com. That's it for this week. Thank you for your company. I hope you'll join me at the same time next week for another edition of What is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Barbara Hand Clow.
Thank you.